This is TWiT.
TWiT also has an article in The Atlantic this month about American rage and the untold story of how anger became the dominant emotion in our politics and personal lives. And we were talking before the show began. I think we've lost Paris. We're going to try to get her back. What happened? We're getting her back, just as I said. We lost her. We're trying to get her back. And we were talking before the show. Poor Paris has to. For the nature of her work at Wired is to visit Twitter regularly, even 4chan and all the other pockets of rage on the internet. It really does feel like we're more angry these days. And I also feel like it's somewhat because we've been given tools. Anger has been weaponized by places like Twitter. You like Twitter, though. You're not a...
I acknowledge all of Twitter's problems and have written about a lot of them. My own little bubble within Twitter is a pleasant place to be, and it's not something I do grudgingly.
Yeah.
You
like it, but you're in a bubble, you admit.
Yes. I totally acknowledge. Yeah. The fact that I like Twitter does not mean that everybody likes Twitter or even can like Twitter. It's like any other medium. It's very complex, and it depends on how you intersect with it and who you're talking to, and the topics you talk about, and who you are, and who people perceive you to be.
Paris, we were when you were gone. I'm glad we got you back. We were talking about Duhigg's other article in this month in the Atlantic about the real roots of American rage and how angry everybody is. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned that you have to live in the cesspools of anger on the internet as part of
every day. It's on Twitter, Reddit, Vote, Gab, 4chan. It's the internet.
You hang out on Gab too?
You got to. I tried to hang out there. I have a couple of tools that monitor Gab for a couple of key words, but I think a large part about writing about online extremism is just keeping tabs on a variety of different parts of the internet and generally the worst parts of the internet.
Is it your sense that it's worse today than it's been, or is it that
I think that that's a hard question, and I think it's because when we say worse, we can see worse things more easily, but I think that these bad things have always been there, or these awful conversations and this hate has always existed. It's just now that because of the proliferation of social media and the ease of access we have to all these different mediums, these sort of groups and the hateful rhetoric that they espouse, they are much more high profile, and you can access them by just searching.
I think if you go back to news groups in the 80s or 90s, you will find parallels, but a tiny percentage of the people in the world were in news groups. They weren't the least bit mainstream. Therefore people weren't aware of it, and it did not become national news stories, and the President of the United States wasn't diving in to it in the way that happens today.
Yeah, I didn't even consider the president element, but I think, without a doubt, it's easier to broadcast these ideas. I think it's easier to recruit, vulnerable members of society to some of these causes. I think there are more, it's spilling over into the real world now. So, people are acting on these conspiracies such as Pizzagate, or, there are probably other better examples. But to me, QAnon. It seems... Yeah, QAnon. I think that without a doubt, the hate is rising in America. I think that it's more accepted than it's been, at least in my lifetime.
Here's my theory. I want to try this out on y'all. When you go, there's signs on bridges in some bridges in this country that when troops are marched across bridges to break step, not to march in lockstep, because their step will resonate and actually cause the bridge to get more and more resonate and break it. Whereas if they don't march in lockstep, there's no resonance created. My theory is that anger, and Duhigg talks about this in his Atlantic article, anger is self-reinforcing. It's not something that, there are things you can do that get it out of your system and then it goes away, but anger and revenge create a vicious circle that they amplify themselves. And that's always been the case, but my theory is that there's a resonating frequency that Twitter and Facebook, and to a lesser degree, because they're lesser used, Gab and places like that, are acting as a resonating agent. They're getting it to amplify to the breaking point. And so it's not that the anger hasn't always existed. It's that there are now in our society things that are amplifying it to the point where it's actually it's becoming a more and more rapid cycle of anger, right? Isn't that what you see on Twitter?
I mean, social media amplifies everything. And actually, social media often amplifies things in a positive way. I think people just don't pay quite as much attention to it because it's nothing to worry about. And arguably, it can amplify lies and hate more powerfully than it amplifies the good stuff.
The problem is we're attracted to this, right? And so systems like Facebook that are engineered to reinforce that behavior, to increase engagement, are automatically reinforcing it because that's what engages
people
you.
Stay on longer if they think that they're among a group of people that think just like them, and that's been one thing that I have.
Why doesn't somebody do a happy news site or a happy news newspaper?
Because no one will read it.
Because no one would read it. Because that's not
people love to be outraged. People love to be outraged. People love to be furious. And it, I think, stems because they like feeling like they're part of this kind of in-group. That's one thing that I've noticed when I've been studying, I guess, online conspiracies and online extremism, is that the ones that stay around for the longest seem to share the same note that their adherents have this sense of community. It's them against the world or some other group.
Yes.
I guess in the case of QAnon, why I think that it has existed for almost a year now, or I guess over a year now, is that the base factor of it is that, okay, everybody out in the world is foolish. They don't understand. It's the deep state. We are the only ones that are knowledgeable, and we are the smart ones. And
all conspiracy theories do that.
Yeah, and that's why that they continue to stay around. That's why also when it comes to these sort of hate groups, it's an in-group, out-group thing. Yep. And these social media platforms reward that primal part in our brain that wants to constantly be engaged in a war for all eternity, a war between us and others. It's way more exciting than real life if you are existing in this fake fantasy world that's constantly got you amped up, where you're constantly fighting against shadowy deep state forces or against some other race that you think is inferior and trying to take away your rights in the case of, I guess, white supremacist groups and things like that. These platforms are built to pry into our deepest urges. And
so is there something we should do about this? I mean, I don't think we should shut down Twitter and Facebook. Should Facebook take response? See, Facebook's not going to put good news in the news feed because that's not their business.
Well, they sort of have moved a tiny bit in that direction because they said they're going to put less news in your news feed.
More local.
And give you more stuff from your friends and family, which could be awful. But at least there's a decent chance it's
But you
not
know what
the
the
worst
side effect
of
of that is in that announcement, I think Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it was that wrote the press release when they said they're going to de-emphasize local news, they said instead we're going to promote, like you said, posts from your family, friends, but also things in groups. And do you know what, since January when they made this announcement, has become one of the hottest places for disinformation and extremism? Facebook groups. Yeah. That's where the Gilets Jaunes protests in France.
We talked about this last week. This is a perfect example. I know French people are always angry, right? I mean, there's a multi-century history of barricades and riots. In fact,
and there are some genuine points to the Gilets Jaunes protests, but there's also a large part of it that has arisen just from unbridled rage, conspiracy theories that has come out of these Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands. One of them even has over 1 million members.
Yeah, and they're local because they're all by département. But the thing I find interesting is this is actually France is probably a really good test tube for this because they've always had protests. The grand boulevards of Paris were designed so that they couldn't be barricaded. That's why there's boulevards. That's why Haussmann built the boulevards, is so that they could easily unbarricade them and troops could march in and break up the protests. But I mean, if you've ever seen Les Miserables, you know. I mean, this is a long-standing history. But what's unique about the Yellow Jacket protests is that if you ask somebody, they can't really pinpoint the reason for their anger. It's like it's a generalized upset.
Yeah, it's an amorphous kind of ball of rage. It ostensibly began because it was tied to the gas tax hike that was supposed to come in January. But then Macron said, okay, we're doing away with that, or at least going to suspend it for 6 months. And then 2 days later, France had the biggest protest it's had ever related to these the gay, jaune, and yellow vests, and it has continued to spiral.